Hello, everyone. Good evening. Welcome. Good evening to everyone here in the auditorium and also joining us by live stream. I've asked people to so our camera picks up this nice big audience. This, I think, is the first live lecture in Steinberg Auditorium for the Sam Fox School Art lecture series in a year and a half. So feels really good to be here, yeah. And it's also just a beautiful day here in St. Louis, and we couldn't be more thrilled to be hosting Stephanie Syjuco for the Fall 2021 Prensky Visiting Artist Island Press this week. I'm Lisa Belosky. I'm the director of Island Press, professor of art, and MFA chair in the Sam Fox School at Washington University. First, I want to just thank all of you for coming tonight, and also thank Dr. Arthur Prensky, who generously supports our efforts at Island Press. And I want to thank the students who have been working hard already and helping with Stephanie's project, and as well to thank the Sam Fox School, especially Dean Carmen Colangelo and Director Amy Haupt for their ongoing support. You know, I was just trying to refresh my memory. Stephanie and I met in 2019. I had reached out to her to come as a visiting artist, and she wrote back and said, oh, well, coincidentally, I'm having a show at the Contemporary Art Museum. And so we ended up talking over a few months and working out, that she would come to Island Press instead of just giving a lecture, but come and do a print project with us here. But I've been following her work, I think, since 2009, and so it is just a thrill to have Stephanie here. She arrived on Sunday, and we've already had a really fun and productive couple of days here in the print shop. I think Stephanie's going to be sharing some of the ideas and even maybe some pictures of what we've been working on in the print shop. She'll be here all week through Friday, so if you're interested, you can stop in, and if you want to help, we have room for more helpers on Wednesday afternoon and Friday, so please feel free to come by the Bixby Print Shop, 110 Bixby Hall. And just to tell you a little about the format of tonight's lecture, Stephanie will talk about her work, and following her talk, Samantha Sloan will lead a Q&A and moderate some discussion with Stephanie. And because we're live streaming, I just want to let you know that we're going to have mics that we will pass around. If you want to ask a question or add to the discussion, please wait till we get to you with the microphone. So now I want to introduce Samantha Sloan, who will introduce Stephanie. Samantha Sloan is a Filipino-American artist and an MFA in visual art candidate here at the Sam Fox School. Her current work explores environmental issues by looking at the socioeconomic and consumerist systems that exacerbate them. In her oil paintings, she frames themes of capitalism and colonialism using still lifes from the Dutch Golden Age as a visual reference. She subtly contrasts first world paradigms with intersectional identities of the diaspora to confront and speak to both climate and social justice. Her work is regularly on view at Francesca Anderson Fine Art in Lexington, Massachusetts, and right here in her studio at the Sam Fox School. So please welcome Samantha Sloan.
Do a little mic test. Good? Okay. Welcome, Stephanie Syjuco. Thank you so much for coming, and everyone that's met you so far loves you, so you should know that. So Stephanie is coming to us from the Bay Area in Oakland, California, where she currently teaches at the University of California, Berkeley. Her work was recently exhibited at our very own Contemporary Art Museum here in St. Louis in 2019. And she's also exhibited at MoMA PS1, the Whitney Museum of American Art, the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, and much more. Born in the Philippines, she received her MFA from Stanford University and BFA from the San Francisco Art Institute. And she's received a Guggenheim Fellowship Award, a Joan Mitchell Painters and Sculptors Award, and a Tiffany Foundation Award. Now, Stephanie, as you'll see, has a very diverse practice. She works in installation, photography, and sculpture, and she combines craft methods with technology and social practice, using both handmade and fabricated media to merge the historic and analog with the contemporary and digital in this beautifully conscious and critical way. Using critical wit and collaborative co-creation, her projects leverage open source systems, shareware logic, and flows of capital in order to investigate issues of economy and empire. Recently, she has focused on how photography and image-based processes are implicated in the construction of racialized, exclusionary narratives of history and citizenship. And as Lisa said, she'll be here with us through Friday if you guys want to visit her at Island Press. And thank you, Stephanie.
All right. Thank you so much, Sam, for the introduction. And also Lisa and Tom for such an amazing time at Island Press so far. As was mentioned, I'll be here all week, so drop in. Hopefully I'll have a chance to pull you in and you can actually work for me. That's always wonderful. But yeah, so again, welcome, and I just feel so honored to be here. It is such a beautiful day. It's the first time folks have gathered in a really long time. And so I just want to take a moment to just share how thankful I am. Okay, so with that, let's see. All right, so I decided to call my talk tonight Image Trafficking, on the politics of imaging and constructed representation. And I'm actually going to share some kind of experimental works. So, as an artist, I have a chance to give numerous talks. A lot of them, I think, are kind of works that I've already, feel pretty confident about. And to kind of shake things up a little bit, I'm actually going to show some works that I don't generally talk about as much. Partly because, you can go online and you can see existing talks, and I thought it would be really fun to kind of tailor this presentation for the folks here, but also to see a little bit more of behind the scenes of what I've been thinking about. So when I think about image trafficking, it'll start to kind of become, more apparent based on the projects I'm going to share. But the other thing I want to talk about too is that even though I've been working a lot in photography per se, I think I'm more interested in the notion of image making, which is really different from, kind of traditional forms of photography or, cameras. So with that, just a kind of background on what some of my previous projects have looked like. Usually they're large scale and they're installations. In many cases, I collaborate with museums and institutions to create works that sometimes have hundreds or even thousands of objects that are produced, and in some cases distributed as well. So those can look like temporary vending installations or collected cultural objects that mimic museum displays, or in some cases like public social spaces. But I'm really going to focus on not these things. So I also like to kind of show this diagram because as a contemporary artist, I feel like my work really goes out into many different fields. And so although sculpture is at the center, because that is what I studied when I was an undergraduate, and a lot of my stuff kind of goes back to having a real thingness attached to it, I also do like to really pay attention to these other fields, which is everything from social practice to new media to textiles and craft and photography and video, 3D modeling, and also public projects like print and publications, as well as workshops. So I love this constellation of stuff. And I'm always surprised because as a professor at Berkeley, students are always worried about, well, I have to pick this thing that I do. And I'm always trying to tell them, no, actually, you can do everything. You should do it all, and you should mix it up, and you should make it as wild as possible. I also like to think about my works as existing in multiple spheres. So even though as a contemporary fine artist, the fallback is sort of like, showing in museums and galleries, I actually see these other circles as completely interesting, viable, and important spaces to show. So along with the art world, we have, the greater public, which implicates society, citizenship, and community. The academy as well, because as a professor, I see that my work there, pedagogically as well as conceptually, intersects a lot with the themes that I work on in my own artwork. And So I use this image also as a kind of placeholder to talk about my projects relating to the construction of images. And so what we're looking at here is really a stock photo. It's a commercial image of a typical studio photo lighting setup. And it's got the different backdrops, it's got the lighting kit, and all the kind of objects and implements to make the photo. And what we're missing here in this image is actually the subject, right? But in the end, all this other kind of, the construction of the tableau or the stage or the set is actually the thing that I've become more interested in, because it has a really strong hand in kind of framing what we think we're looking at. And I'm going to start off just really briefly talking about, I think, one of the photo projects that's received the most attention that I've done. And the reason I'm not going to go into it very much, actually, is because it's made me think of a lot since doing it. This is a project from 2013 to 2016 called Cargo Cults. And it was one of the very first photographic works that I've done. And it's also one of the first works in which I kind of used myself as a model or a stand-in. And I really did that out of convenience. I didn't want to use other people to, to model for me. And since it was just myself in the studio, I was playing with different setups. I made this work in residence in Omaha, Nebraska. So I was at the Bemis Center for Contemporary Art, which is located, right in the middle of the United States. And I was trying to create these faux ethnographic photos, which reminded me of images from the 19th century and early 20th century that I'd seen taken in the Philippines, where my family is from. And so, in the early 20th century, the Philippines was an American colony. And so there was a lot of interaction, between the United States and the Philippines, but definitely in the kind of empire-colony relationship. And so a lot of the photographs of the Philippines at the time, were about kind of documenting these new peoples that all of a sudden, were potentially to become Americans. Obviously, that didn't happen. But so as I was making these images, I was going to shopping malls in Omaha, Nebraska, going to stores like The Gap, Urban Outfitters, Target, and buying clothes that appeared somehow ethnic, and then taking them back to my studio and styling them in such a way to kind of amplify this historic ethnographic image. So they're all very constructed. They're also, in my eyes, kind of playful, but critical too when thinking about, what do we assume when we look at and what do we project onto an ethnic type. The fun thing, though, about this series is that you can also see, if you look really closely, you can see price tags still attached to all the objects. Because after I would buy the clothes on my credit card, and then after styling them in my studio, I would go back to the stores and return them for full store credit. So it was also a way to kind of, push back against this notion of the idea of consuming, an identity. And so on the top, the left image on the top of my head is an Urban Outfitters shopping bag. Around my neck is a sock from Target. I also have, different items from, I think, Charlotte Russe, Forever 21, and Gap belts as, necklaces and that kind of thing. And so the reason, though, I'm starting with this and not really talking about it a lot is because I learned that after 25 years of being a professional artist, somehow this work became the most popular out of all the other works that I've done and all the other images I've made. And I've had a lot of time to think about why. It turns out that despite, I think, my attempt to be critical with these images, they were actually highly consumable. And I think they're, I think that they're beautiful looking and interesting, but I think I was also kind of tapping into the kind of fantasy that I actually wanted to critique. And so since then, I've been very conscious about stepping away from this type of work, but also thinking about how to now, rethink representation. So I also like to start off talking about this work, which is not an artwork, but it's an experiment that I did starting in 2003. So this is a screenshot. In 2003, the internet was still fairly newish, and along the way were also the invention of free stock photo sites. And as an experiment, I decided to upload an image of myself. to a free stock photo site. So here it is. I labeled it Kissing Air. It's 2003. And then from here, anyone can download and use this image to do anything with what they like. You know, they could use it to illustrate an article or, you know, add it to a pamphlet, who knows. And a couple years later, I realized that I could track where this image goes, because you can do reverse Google image. And it's been really interesting to see how this has been used. So here's, you know, a kind of like rough breakdown of where it's been. And so unbeknownst to myself, it's been that an image of myself has been used to advertise everything from, you know, this is a Christian article that's critical about how, you know, sex is used to sell things. And there I am, you know, kind of advertising it. This is also me advertising a Filipina dating site. So, you know, Christian dating, actually, again. And then here I am advertising a gayltr.com website, which I think is great. And I seem to have been involved in a happy love story. So, you know, hi, my name is Julia, and I wanted to say thank you to your wonderful advice site. I was always shy and didn't know how to meet other women. After searching the web for a partner, I stumbled across your site. It's a little unclear whether I'm Julia or Julia found me, but I'm really, you know, I'm fascinated by how this image has traveled. And it's also been used in other stock photo sites. So the fun thing about a free image is that other stock photo sites can download it, upload it to their own, and use it. So it's traveled quite a bit. And I also like seeing the kind of context in which it's placed. You know, so here it is and how it exists with other like images in that set. You know, here it is used in an article about weird Asian news, Japan's new kissing machine. There I am advertising a city in New Zealand. I don't know why, but, you know, next to the beach and a smiling, happy child. And then I'm also used as avatars for different other people. So I'm Lily Chen, who's 24 years old in New York. Yeah, there's more on Lily. And then also, for some reason, I got really popular on Polish websites. And so it must have started with one Polish stock photo site, but here I am. I'm a placeholder, actually, in a company in which you can buy mugs, and then you replace my photo or those other people's photos with your own photo on your mug. But there I am as a placeholder. And then here I am with an Italian boyfriend, you know, promoting something in Italy. And then here I am also promoting a Chinese massage parlor in Amsterdam. So, you know, it's kind of funny, but it's also kind of weird, actually. And I bring this sort of project or experiment up because what it's made me think about is that despite, you know, no matter what I think my image or any image is doing, how it's actually used and trafficked, apart from myself, is actually something I can't control. And whether that's, you know, to promote things that I agree with or not, or even, you know, what's assumed of an Asian woman who's kissing air, you know, is it an innocuous image, or is it highly sexualized, or, you know, or what? So I think, you know, this is some background for my thinking about image trafficking. So that goes into a more recent project that I showed in Hawaii called Diversity Pictures. This is a screenshot of one of the works. It's called Multi-Ethnic Group of People Smiling. And these are captions taken from stock photos when you Google diversity. So if you Google diversity in a stock photo site, different images come up, and I look at the captions, and I see what they say. And can you imagine, can you think about what this could look like in your head? I can. How about this one? Row of multi-ethnic babies sitting side by side looking away, isolated on gray background. Got it? Yes. Okay. Multiracial best friends, millennials taking selfie outdoors with backlighting. Happy youth friendship concept against racism with international young people having fun together. Azure filter tone. These are great. These are like golden. You don't even need the image, do you? Laughing senior and multi-ethnic sports people putting hands together at park. Happy group of men and women smiling and stacking hands outdoors. multi-ethnic sweaty team cheering after intense training. Yes! Top view of mixed race business team sitting at the table at loft office and working. Woman manager brings the document. I mean, I think these are great. You don't really need to see the images, but if you must, I will show them. Close-up face of happy multi-ethnic children embracing each other and smiling at camera. Team of smiling kids embracing together in a circle. Portrait of young boy and pretty girls looking at camera. So, these are standard stock photos, and they're made because there's a market for it. There's also a use for the idea of diversity and what that looks like, which is unproblematic, happy, and smiling. And, it makes sense, right? Like, I feel like, we see images like this all the time. And I think the irony of it is that we've been living in an age for quite a while, in which this isn't exactly the reality. So what is it about these images that are so popular, and why are they trafficked so much? So the exhibition, as I showed it, was vinyl on the wall. This was at in Hawaii, at the Johnson Gallery, and the colors for each panel, and you never got to see the photographs. It was literally just the text on the panel. The colors were the color average of the stock photo itself, and that was it. And then you were left to kind of imagine what that could look like. And I think about this a lot because I grew up in the 1980s, and the Benetton ads at the time were sort of like the first wave of this notion of a kind of global unity, multicultural performance. And does everybody remember this? Or who remembers this? Yeah, remember, it was so popular. And what it did was it kind of brought together this notion that, we are all one people, we celebrate our diversity, and we come together. And, here's another image of, if I Google diversity on the stock photo sites, this is kind of, what you get. I love these, they're so terrible. And, I was also thinking, yeah, okay, so then I did this other search, protest. And what was amazing about it is that there's a whole lot of stock photos of protest in which the signs they're all blank, because you're meant to then download it and fill in whatever you want into it. But at the same time, I think that's an interesting metaphor for maybe what the confusion is about how some people don't understand actually what we're fighting for or what we're protesting. And these are highly staged. These are not taken out in the world. They're actually, they're produced to be consumed and used in specific ways. And they look highly mannered too. And so I was just looking at these and checking them out and realizing that, there's a kind of, I'm so fascinated by this. Here again, empty protest signs. They actually kind of remind me of, the color fields that I was using in the earlier caption work. And then also, oddly enough, about like skin tone, or skin color charts. So, and then thinking about color, some of my early work, and I'm sorry, but it looks like some of my captions are going to get cut off on the left or on the right there, so bear with me. A series of photographic works that I did were using the kind of chroma key green backdrop as a subject matter. So thinking about how, the construction, all the things that go into the construction of the image all of a sudden come to the foreground. The Chroma Key Aftermath series was done in 2018, or 2017, right after the 2016 presidential inauguration, when a lot of protests were erupting, and a lot of the news media was improperly covering it, in the sense that, remember both sides and the whole notion of how, each side was violent. And so in the Bay Area, we also had a number of white nationalist and white supremacist gatherings on campus. And a lot of anti-fascist protesters were showing up to resist, and street battles were erupting. So I was present at a lot of those and also able to witness the scenes, but also the aftermath. And so based on what I saw, I decided to reconstruct a kind of tableau of some of the things that were present in the aftermath of these battles. Everything from flags, sticks, and rocks, and nettings and barriers, and bricks, to, bandanas, and then constructing it all out of the green chroma key fabric as well as painted green objects, and then shooting it almost as a way to kind of think about how the sort of media overlay onto what was actually happening on the street had a huge hand in constructing the public perception of what was actually happening. And, I think about this too because the both historical battles as well as present battles, they all seem to still be connected. And in California, oddly enough, we have Civil War reenactments also. Yeah, very strange. I discovered that I've been fascinated by Civil War reenactments simply because, the obvious reason of like, well, what actually is being reenacted? What hasn't quite, laid itself to rest, and why, we have to keep revisiting it, even in a kind of playful or play acting kind of way. And in California, in Guerneville, which is only like an hour and a half from San Francisco, there's a yearly Civil War Days reenactment. And so I would go to kind of like, check it out and figure it out. This is a shot on the right of a photo studio that was set up to kind of shoot some of the reenactors so they could have a souvenir of their time. I also became really fascinated with commercial sewing patterns, which dealt with American historical iconic costumes. And so the patterns on the left are actually things that are used a lot for, theater or even, Halloween or kind of, role-playing situations. And, based on some of this thinking through, American history and why we sort of keep needing to construct and, reconstruct or revisit it, and also using some of the sewing patterns that I was getting from these sewing companies, I created a whole series of sewn garments called The Visible Invisible. And all of these use the green chroma key backdrop photo fabric as their main garment fabric. This was shown at the Smithsonian in 2018, and I also really appreciated that because it was at the heart of, it was the most American of American museums. And so this, I chose three what I thought are iconic garments or time periods. So the Plymouth Pilgrim, along with the kind of narrative that we're usually, told in school about the founding of the country and, the sort of the Thanksgiving with indigenous folks. The colonial revolution is the one on the right, and that's 1776, the sort of founding of American democracy, but in truth it was only for white men, And then in the center, the gorgeous yet incredibly problematic antebellum South. So the kind of opulent, the ribbons, the lace, the ruffles, and with that, so as I was making this work, and it was really important that I hand make it. So I learned 19th century ribbon embroidery techniques, as well as lace crochet, bonnet making, and all the kind of, the details, because I really wanted to have a hand in kind of constructing the United States, almost as much as I felt like the United States, was constantly constructing itself the entire time. So I love the details on these things, and it took me about a year actually to make everything, because the ruffles on the Civil War dress are actually, I think, 220 feet of ruffling, and the dresses, though, are kind of fictions, actually. They're not authentic. They're, the patterns that were made for them are a kind of smoothing over of a lot of things. They're caricatures, and so anyone who's actually familiar with an authentic kind of period costume at the time would notice, changes. And I was also thinking, too, about, that kind of stage managing or the smoothing over of history. At the very back of the installation, and you can't see it from left to right, but I sewed a 26-foot by 15-foot high gray and white checkerboard fabric backdrop, quilted backdrop, which is reminiscent of the Photoshop transparency filter, or the transparency layer. So the very back layer of Photoshop, you find this, gray and white checkerboard pattern, which you're actually not supposed to see, because it means that you've hit the end, you've reached the back of it. And by hand making it and hand sewing it, I also wanted to kind of talk about, that even the digital creation or the digital manipulation of things is highly worked, highly manipulated. So on to then thinking about history, thinking about revisions of history, and also thinking about the ways that we still talk about historical things. I was invited in 2019 to have an exhibition at the Contemporary Art Museum in St. Louis, and as part of it, I decided to work with the curators on a new work in response to the St. Louis World's Fair, because obviously, it happened here. It's also a much beloved event, but upon more investigation, it turns out it had incredibly problematic things attached to it, and especially what were called at the time the human zoos. But before I get there, this is just some background. And it's funny, as I was putting this together, I usually have to talk about this with people not in St. Louis. So I go on, I talk about it, and then the World's Fair, and then, it was like this technological marvel, and millions of people came, and it was amazing. But I think you all know that, right? Yes, okay, cool. So anyway, so skipping along, this is an overview of the Philippine village, because definitely at the time, it was 1904. And the Philippines was a United States colony at the time. So it was definitely one of the places in which the World's Fair showcased, their new kind of colony. And so this vast and really elaborate village was constructed. And this is just one part of the fair. I mean, it looks huge, and it was. The Philippine village itself took up a lot of space because it was a huge tourist attraction. And so, the peoples, the over 1,200 peoples imported in, were made to kind of perform, their ethnic identities and their sort of tribal affiliations in these daily staged rituals. I don't like showing ethnographic photos. The reason I'm showing this, though, is because there is an example attached to it, and I actually think this one in particular is a lot less egregious than many of the others that I found. But, so this was a popular image. It was probably reproduced in postcards and, tourist items. And it's a free image. It's in the public domain. So you can also find it online. It's on Wikimedia Commons. You can download it and you can use it, for anything you want. And with the idea being that it's for research and educational purposes is probably the assumption. It's also, because it's in the public domain, it can also be captured as a stock photo and sold, which is ironic, right? So here it is used as being re-commodified, and to me that's super fascinating, because in the very beginning, these folks' identities were the commodity as they were on display. And then after time, that faded into a kind of like educational historical resource. And yet now with our, contemporary digital culture, we can recapture these folks and also recapitalize off of them. So, you can download the image. You can find it for free, but you can also pay for it if you didn't realize it was for free. And you can see all the different resolutions and ways that you can use it for. So that's interesting. And it's interesting because, the history of photography is so implicated also in the history of anthropology and ethnography and all the ways in which people were conscripted as subjects and also performed the cheap or free labor for the large-scale photographic enterprise. And I like to share this, kind of focus on Ariela Azule, who is a wonderful theorist and also photo critic, really, who thinks a lot about this. And so, knowing this and then coming to St. Louis, how am I supposed to respond or react to the history here of how Filipinos were viewed? I was able to spend 2 weeks actually researching both at the archives of the Missouri Historical Society, the St. Louis Public Library, and also the Mercantile Library. And what that meant was spending a lot of time looking through files and also setting up a kind of ad hoc copy stand where I had a camera on a tripod. And, so after looking and looking and looking and finding folder and folder and folder of images that were basically produced to be consumed as a tourist gaze at, Filipinos, the best reaction I could have as to how to represent that was to actually block the gaze. And so what I did sequentially was literally re-photograph these images, but with my hands covering them up. So, denying the kind of the initial look and the ability to get what you thought you were looking for. And in that, I also leave, though, the surrounding areas. So you still kind of have the context of where the people are, or even the captions, so you kind of know what's happening. But I want to sort of deny the ability for these images to keep presenting the same thing over and over and over. Because the truth is, we're not going to burn the archive. I mean, they won't let us. And it's not going to go away. And so, how can we, how as artists should we present these things, hopefully responsibly and hopefully with a critical eye as to, what we can add to it, or how we can change them. So, I did this for hundreds of images, actually. And in the end, settled on about 30 that I created an installation for called Block Out the Sun. And the images are all printed on 8x10 aluminum backings, and then arranged in a vitrine so that you're forced to, the original display had it so you're forced to walk around the vitrine in the round, and you could never see all the hands in the same direction, so your body had to move around, and in every instance, you couldn't see. You saw everything else but the subject. The nice news is, Block Out the Sun right now is at SLAM as part of an exhibition, and it'll be up till January. And it's actually included in the portion of an exhibition around the St. Louis World's Fair. So it's interesting to have it back, and I really appreciate its inclusion. So again, thinking about representation, this is a color calibration chart produced by Adobe Systems in the late 80s, early 90s. Does anyone remember this? Yes. Okay, so if you were a graphic designer at the time, which I was a graphics and exhibition designer at the Exploratory Museum in San Francisco, you were forced to look at this image and then as a printout or as a digital image, and then look at your own images and make sure that the colors seemed like they matched. And I think this is hilarious because you have this kind of like faux Carmen Miranda-esque lady with fruit on her head, and you can see the letters on her head spell out Adobe, and it kind of makes no sense at all that somehow this is a correct image. I also became really interested in other photo calibration charts that I would find. So the more I delved into the realm of photography, the more I found standards that you kind of had to keep checking against. And inevitably, they would be these sort of everything from still lifes to the scenes that kind of seem to make sense for photographers, like the happy wedding. And then in a lot of cases, they made no sense at all. They were just like slamming together different things that were colorful. And I really liked this like crazy juxtaposition. It's like, the crayons and fruit and, clocks and babies and hot women in bikinis and boats. I mean, it just, it makes no sense at all. And then I really love the ones in which there's this huge like performance of identity in them too. And, this one in particular, I think is really fun and funny, because everyone is like kind of their extreme selves. And then, here's a version also of, less extreme, but still, quite sort of segmented. And this inspired another installation that was shown at the Contemporary Art Museum in 2019. This is a big work called Dodge and Burn, Visible Storage, and it's a 20-foot by 15-foot high sort of platform tableau display that mashes up all sorts of images and objects. So it's got digital photos on printed vinyl, on laser cut wood, chroma key fabric, printed backdrops, artificial plants, and lots of other sort of manufactured props. And on closer inspection, what I'm really hoping the viewer does is kind of sift through a huge array of references. Because what I'm doing is I'm rampantly downloading images that are both historical as well as from stock photo sites, museum collections and holdings. So there's artifacts here from the Metropolitan Museum's collection in New York of the Philippines. There's also cosmetic skin charts, textures of textiles, fruit, stock photos of tropical fruit, and all of these are laser cut. So they're, I download the image and I print it on adhesive vinyl and then adhere it to laser cut wood. So it's kind of looks a little bit like a three-dimensional prop. And there's also these green chroma key elements that are also hinting at a kind of struggle on the sidelines. And so everything from chroma key painted tiki torches to these what appear to be green mega hats, or reminiscent of a kind of hat that you would find, you know, at a mega rally. Floating heads, religious icons, poop emojis dotting around and kind of commenting on some of the scenarios. A lot of images of people looking out or looking at themselves in mirrors, a lot of doubling happening. Historical references, like this is anthropologist Alfred Kroeber and Ishi, the supposed last of the Indians who he had found and then had live at UC Berkeley as a kind of living specimen. And also mixed in with references to contemporary protest, whether it's like the black balaclava masks, anti-fascist protesters, and you know, hidden away rocks and bricks and sticks, things that kind of hint at a resistance to the sort of, you know, the story being told frontally. So in some cases, you had to kind of walk off to the side to view these things, or they were hidden in, you know, in the main objects. Yeah, fists and color calibration charts. So, you know, along with that kind of work, I was really honored to also be a part of the Smithsonian Artist Research Fellowship right before COVID hit, actually. So I wound up wrapping up my entire residency there, but turns out artists can apply to work or get access to different archives at the Smithsonian. And so I wound up working with David Haberstich, who's the curator of photography at the Archive Center at the National Museum of American History. And I was super excited because, you know, again, I wanted to go to that most American of American places and just kind of discover it and mine it and see what was there. And my attempt, though, and this is kind of interesting, in the end, I didn't find what I was looking for, but I found a lot of other things. You know, the museum itself is obviously built on this, you know, notion of, you know, here, this is one of the hallways, you know, the nation we build together. And always my question is, you know, well, who is the we building it, and who is it for, and whose story does it tell? Because it's quite incomplete. And, you know, from my experience in the archives, and again, this is me searching and, you know, spending literally weeks in the archives. Like, it's a very long and slow process. You go through databases to call up different files and folders. It takes a while for them to be found and then sent to you. And then literally you sift through it. And in some cases you find nothing. You know, like it's just going through over and over different files. But what I was looking for, actually, I wanted to find photos and documents in relationship to Filipinos and Filipino Americans. And the reason I wanted to do that was not because I wanted to find any authentic, you know, discovery of my heritage. It was because I wanted to see what the empire documented of its colony. Like, how did it frame it? How did it, you know, record it? How did it remember it? And it turns out it doesn't. I was really surprised at how little was there. And, you know, you can search online for their databases. A lot of things that were there were about kind of peripheral notions of the Philippines. So, you know, stamps, plant samples, you know, most of it is plant samples pulled from the country. In other cases, it's, you know, military photos of American soldiers there, but not so much of Filipinos themselves. It's almost as if, you know, they had dropped out of the, you know, of the search engine. Like, here's a search. You know, I type in Filipino American and I get 29 websites, which are more like blog entries or like articles, but nothing in the holdings. And what that means actually is not that they're not there. It's just that they're not tagged, or they're not cross-referenced, or, you know, the curators aren't looking to have that as a kind of, you know, informational finding aid. And so part of my idea was that I would try to look for it. And what I was finding though was really interesting, I thought, through this this lens of distance and history. And in some cases, like this is an example, the image on the right is it's a terrible, terrible, poorly represented image. It's originally a photo from the 1900s of a Filipino guerrilla who was fighting against the United States, was photographed, turned into a stereo card, and then once in the museum's collection was scanned and turned into a microfilm image, which is a really, really tiny kind of like bad resolution image of itself. And then from there, rescanned and then put online as the image. So you can't actually see the original image. It's too fragile for them to pull out. So this is the only reference that we have to this image in the collection. And I started thinking of these things as more interesting metaphors for the distance and loss of memory, as opposed to thinking about, a high resolution good image. So as I'm going through, I'm also just showing some behind the scenes of my process. As I'm going through archives, I just rampantly collect and download. In some cases, I'm reshooting or I'm pulling images off the, off the database and collecting them. And then I kind of compile and I sift them. And I start to think about narratives. I turn things over. Because it turns out, in a lot of cases, if something is scanned and put on an online museum archive, it's only the front image. And there's a lot of interesting information on the back or things that might even contradict what's happening in the image. And so those things, they're in the archives. They're just not referenced properly, or they're not referenced with an eye to be interesting. I reshoot a lot of documents too. And this is kind of funny because this is me shooting photocopies of notated document, so it's like the copy of the copy. And then part of my process is also reprinting the images in different ways. So before COVID hit and everything shut down, I was actually 10 days into a residency at the Joan Mitchell Foundation in New Orleans. And so my studio included, a lot of reprinting and kind of piling up to sort of see, new juxtapositions of what I could narrate from this incomplete and incoherent collection. And how that's turned out actually is a new series that's going to debut in January in New York at my gallery. It's a series called Latent Images. This is an image called Better America. And I've been printing these tiny images that I take. I've been printing them on color laserjet prints and then taping them together so that they're blown up and they form a really big poster. So you can kind of see, the lines, the cut lines and the tape. And then I re-photograph this crappy object and I print it at the size of 60 by 40 as a high-end photograph. So it's again gone through this sort of like degradation and retranslation. And I love this image in particular because it's literally from a slideshow called Better America lecture service. And this particular lecture is on poverty, and yet it's so scratched up and hard to read that it becomes almost like an abstract vision of itself. This also is from a file folder actually documenting the business practices of the KKK. And again, like how do you deal with that? How do you talk back to it? And so my idea was to turn all the documents over to show the reverses and re-photograph it as a way to kind of deny what they wanted to project from the front, and then taping them together in a really crappy kind of manner, and then reshooting it again at high resolution and printing it quite large. So you know what, I just realized though, for the sake of time, I'm gonna skip all this stuff. And I'm actually, I've got two more things to show. This is a current project that I'm also working on at the Amon Carter Museum of American Art. And so again, I'm obsessed with the history of America. And I like looking at it because I like seeing, how it applies to me or how it thinks it applies to me, and maybe how it doesn't. And the nice thing about being invited by this museum was that they specialize in 19th century cowboy and American art of the West. And so, their collection looks a lot like this. It's this very sort of heroic imagery, a lot of taming of the West or manifest destiny and going out into, the westward expansion. And as I was looking at these paintings during a site visit, I started really looking at the hands, because all the hands in these paintings seemed to be doing things. You know, they were very active, and they were also very controlling. And the hands became a kind of metaphor, I think, for, you know, what was actually happening in the landscape and in American society at the time. There was also a lot of pointing and signing and, you know, lawmaking attached to these hands. So it wasn't just all about guns and whips. And then, you know, they also have this amazing kind of collection of these beautiful landscapes by Albert Bierstadt, who's a famous German painter of the West. And so my proposal for this large hallway, 50 feet long, was to create these 2 vinyl wall murals. And these are all in progress. The show is going to open in January. And I'm using the Bierstadt landscapes as backdrops, and in one case, turning it into a kind of chroma key backdrop of itself on one wall, and then on another wall, duplicating it so it's almost like a Rorschach test. And on top of it, so the bottom wall, this is a visual mock-up that I've had to make to show the curators. On top of the vinyl wall are going to be 25 metal prints of man hands. So, you know, these are directly taken from the museum and gallery. So if a museum visitor sees this, they'll be able to actually find these exact hands in the rest of the museum. And these are set off the wall, you know, about maybe an inch or 2. And they're literally dotting the landscape as if, you know, being implicated in the construction and manipulation of the landscape. And then lastly is the chroma key backdrop and 4 new photographs in which I was working with the museum preparator staff to reshoot some of their iconic Frederick Remington cowboy sculptures, but rephotographing them in a ways that made them seem less monumental. So they're all facing away from the camera in a kind of unheroic pose. And they have all their little sort of accessories, their collection accessories attached to them, like the collections tags. The hands on the left are of the preparators who have to kind of hold and manage the objects. And so I'm not allowed to handle these at all. And then, you know, little interventions like the color calibrations and then, you know, the measuring tape. So these are, you know, I'm thinking a lot about, you know, we can't change. We can definitely re-narrate, you know, what's happened. And moving forward, you know, I like looking at this image because honestly, you know, you see the surrounding areas, you see the tape, the marks, the crappiness that surrounds the thing that we're all trying to kind of make heroic and beautiful when telling the story of the United States. And lastly, so this is the work that I'm working on now at Island Press. And it relates to this project, this conceptual project, which actually I've never talked about before, called the Center for the Study of the Tsadai, or the CSST. And it's a meta-archive and study center focused on the media, narration, and pictorial portrayal of the Tsadai, a so-called Stone Age tribe discovered in the Philippines in 1971, and the subject of subsequent controversy. So, but instead of, you know, as some background, a fake Stone Age tribe was found and fooled a lot of anthropologists and media people in the early 70s. And a lot of books were written about it, and then later it was discovered that it was a kind of amplified construction by the dictatorship in the Philippines. But instead of focusing on the hoax itself, the Center for the Study of the Tsadai is more interested in flipping the lens to examine how others studied the Tsadai. So the infrastructure, the news clippings, the pop psychology and fervor generated by the anthropologists, politicians, and international celebrities who flocked to study and protect them. And in so doing, created their own mythology of whiteness, primitiveness, and innocence. And so what does that look like? So the Center for the Study of the Tsadai literally buys as many books as possible floating around on eBay and vintage book sites about the Tsadai. Also, you know, this is a shot of the National Geographic, which made them very famous, and, you know, subsequent books and editions that came out after it. And the articles that were really, really into this notion of this innocent tribe. And again, it was a construction, but it was really, I think, the Western media that aided big time the construction of it, because they really wished for this type of primitive innocence to exist. These are, so the excerpts on the left are pulled from the New York Times page on the right. And I also like showing the context. So a Filipino tribe leaves the Stone Age, and then you have this very sort of fancy fashion scene happening. And so what we're doing right now at Island Press is we're blowing up and reprinting some of these selected news clippings. And I'm kind of curating them in such a way to kind of talk about this constructed narrative. And we're using this really cheap, image transfer technique using black and white Xerox copies on 8.5 by 11 paper. And the students and staff are amazing in helping this, because what I'm also interested in is the kind of analog version of this mistranslation of text and image. So you see the text starting to get kind of blurred or floating away, and that's the result of folks, the way they're rubbing it. Like here's a shot of an original image, and this is one of the images that we're reproducing. And right now it's being tiled together, so you see the kind of like grid-like formation. And everyone is reconstructing this, what I think is a gorgeous image, along with the caption. And it's very hard to see, though, exactly what's happening, because the degradation of the image through the reproduction process of the newsprint, is part of it. So anyway, I'm going to end there, but it's just really, I'm super excited to be here, and I appreciate you listening. So thank you. This on earlier.
So I'm going to kick off with a few questions here, one or two maybe, depending on who wants to speak up in the crowd here, and then I'll leave it up to you guys. And remember that we'll be passing around microphones for whoever wants to ask questions, all right? So you can interpret this first question however you like. The goal is to pick your brain a little bit, but what role does research play in your practice? So how do you think about that process, and what are the different forms that this takes for you?
Yeah, so I guess, practically I showed a lot of, archival research, online research, historical research, but it wasn't until actually I became a professor at a so-called research university that I started to understand that my artistic practice actually had a big research component attached to it. Like, I kind of think as artists, we worry that, that using the word research means we have to be like overly academic. But a lot of it is also about following hunches or investigating, side interests and somehow cycling that back in. So I use the term research really loosely. It's actually like anything I'm interested in. So whether that's, looking at popular culture or, say, the Smithsonian archives, it's all kind of game for me. And I want to privilege that, too, because I think, research for artists should be really broad and valued. Like what we do is really research.
Awesome. The next question that I have here is, when you are formulating ideas for new work, how do you consider collaboration as part of that process? I know you have a few series in the past where having people involved in enacting these ideas is a key part of the concept. So is that something that you strive towards? How much work alone do you do?
Yeah. So a lot of the projects I do can't be done without other people involved. So whether that's, I would say, in some cases, curators are actually collaborators, because, when they invite me to do a project, in many cases, they're also kind of pushing me to, to go in a certain direction. And I actually think that's great, because I'm not really an artist who's very hermetic Like, I like to take in a lot of things, and I also like to be involved with a lot of other people's input. So, whether that's like, say, collaborating with a curator on a new project, or, an actual artistic collaborator. And actually, I didn't really show any formal collaborations with other artists in the work I was showing today. But yeah, I think that I gained so much more from having a more open process about things. And in many cases, I'm also less interested in a kind of, like, I did this, like a kind of authorship. And so, and in other cases too, I'm not, I don't even know if something's an artwork or not. So like the image that floated on the stock photo site, I could claim it as an artwork, I guess, but it's just kind of out there. And maybe I have hidden collaborators, like all those people who downloaded those images and used them. Are they participants and collaborators in a different way?
All right.
Yeah.
It's all you guys.
Let's throw this open too. I'm happy to answer any questions or, talk through anything. And I'll let those folks choose, I guess.
Hi, Stephanie. I have a question about the Eamon Carter project. That seems like a very unusual host for a contemporary art project, and I wondered how it came about.
Oh, you mean, so wait, describe to me why it seems unusual.
All of the American West work that's in there, that doesn't seem like a place that's screaming out for someone to come in and make a contemporary artwork that's commenting on it.
Yeah, no, I'm glad you asked about that. And so I showed that show very specifically too, because so as a Filipino-American artist, or an Asian-American artist, or however you want to kind of categorize me, I get asked a lot to respond to Asian themes. It's always this thing now, it's very popular to bring in an artist from a certain culture and just say, comment or respond to this collection of all the stuff we have from your culture. And then, then you add a kind of, extra on top of it. But when I was invited by the Eamon Carter, they did want me to look at some early photographs of like migrant communities and that kind of thing. And I actually saw all the other stuff, like the cowboys and the grand narrative of the West, and I said, I want to do that. Because I, as an American, and having grown up in the West, I'm a direct, inheritor of all of that kind of politics and history. And so I think they thought it was a little unusual, like, oh, why is she doing this? And it's because I do want to implicate myself in that kind of, heritage and construction of the American cowboy and the West, and not sort of segregate myself to the things that people expect a kind of, representation to embody. So I don't know if that answers it, but I don't know, I did throw it by them. I was like, I know you really wanted me to do this other thing. Is it okay if I go there? And they were like, yeah, I think so. And I think this might be one of the first projects they're commissioning that critically examines that part of the collection. Because they actually just closed an An My Lai show. And that looks at, she's a Vietnamese-American photographer who's looking specifically at the American military and the kind of culture of the military, especially in relationship to Vietnam and war reenactments from Vietnam. But that's from her perspective, as a Vietnamese person. But I think this one is more about that collection, which they really are working hard also to try to figure out how to present differently. But it's a real hard ship to turn,
I had okay, now it's working.
You have a question.
Yes. First off, hi Stephanie, I'm Paul.
Hi.
I had a quick question about the visible invisible, the 3 green dresses that you made. I'm not from St. Louis originally. I'm from Williamsburg, Virginia, which is an area that has very rich historical significance in all 3 of the time eras that you commented on in your piece. And I was struck by how effective the commentary was of taking this motif, the green chroma key, that can be used as something that anything is projected onto, and using that as a way to comment on how we project our own ideals of what we think history should be onto the past. Could you talk a little bit more about what your creative process was going into this piece and how you were able to make that kind of connection? Because it shows up in a lot of your other pieces, and it's so striking.
Thanks for saying that. And actually, I used to live for a short time in Richmond, Virginia, and I was a yearly member to Colonial Williamsburg because I went there so often to watch all the reenactment, like the performance, right, of American culture. And it just, I love it. It's just, it's both a historical pedagogical tool as well as a kind of indoctrinating performance. It's everything all wrapped up into one. And it's friendly and anything. Anyway, so yeah, no, I spent a lot of time in Colonial Williamsburg, actually. And I think, after the 2016 election, I really realized, I needed to kind of, reckon and reclaim, some of the political and historical implications of why we are always at that moment. And so, I also, as an immigrant, so that's the other thing. So, I came to the United States when I was 3. I became a U.S. citizen when I was 26. There was always that question, too, of well, you're not really American. Where are you from? And so my reviewing and redoing this American historical stuff is actually my agency to kind of say, well, I am an inheritor of it, just as any European immigrant might be. So, I don't know. I also just love sewing. It was a really great way to, for 1 year, dive really deep into traditional craft processes, and I went really deep, and it was really good, hand knowledge. But thanks for, I appreciate your appreciation of that work, because it took a long time.
Oh, Lisa.
Hi, I was thinking a lot about the way that people own images and disseminate them and who profits off of them. And I almost hate to ask this question because it's something I'm trying to understand, but have you ever been approached to do an NFT or have an opinion on the singular ownership or authenticity of an image?
Oh, yeah, the NFT thing is so newish to me. I mean, I know artists who are completely doing that, and getting into it, and I kind of just think it's yet one more way to, create an uber capitalist thing that has maybe something to do with art, but is really more about, a kind of asset, just like how a lot of high-end art is also a kind of, asset. So I don't have any strong opinions, actually, except that, a lot of inventions that come from a kind of, Silicon Valley capitalist situation, they don't end well, usually. They start off all fresh and new and this, woo, we can all benefit from this, and then it slowly turns into this, fortress of, yeah. I wish I could.
Hi, I'm Carlos. Nice to meet you. I see your work is very politically strong, and I think it has found a place in institutional work. And I was wondering what is the relation that you find as an artist with the gallery's work, and also because I think that you're showing things that are very hard to swallow. So I was wondering how that affects your. Or how do you navigate this relationship with less institutional part of the artwork?
Oh, you mean galleries and museums and this type of work? Well, but it's on one hand, I think museums right now, they love being criticized. I mean, everyone is inviting artists to come in and like, respond. But what that usually means, that's not like a, what I've found though, is that response is a temporal response. It's temporary. It's meant to kind of alleviate, decades or centuries of a kind of direction that is contrary to where things really should be going. But it's a way to make a commitment for a short time, but not necessarily like a long-term commitment. And so I've actually found that the institutions really want to be critiqued, but to a certain point. The difficulty I found though is sometimes like the commercial gallery demands versus like a museum in which they're not selling anything. Those are really different. Like I try to be mindful. I know this sounds weird, but I'm mindful about the things that I share or show through my commercial galleries because I understand they have a client base to deal with. And so the museum commissions I get, the nice thing is we can kind of just play. Like we've agreed, the curator and I have agreed that we can do this thing, and it doesn't matter if it's popular or not with a collector. And yeah, it's a delicate balance. And so I think hopefully if I'm able to diversify the projects though, and they're really different, in different ways, then it can have different audiences too. But I would like to say my work is really not that political compared to, I think, what really good political work can be. I see them as like these really small interruptions. But thank you for offering that to me.
We have time for one more question.
Hi, I really wanted to first thank you, first for the lecture, but also like, I really appreciated what you said about being like an inheritor to this like American culture, because I feel a kinship to that too. And I guess based on your answer about the Amon Carter Museum, I wanted to ask how else you sort of navigate these like assumptions that museums and institutions will make about like your identity, especially like since a lot of your work is really identity driven.
Actually, so that's interesting. People have said that recently, like, oh, your work is all about Filipinos now. And I actually say, no, it's not. It's actually about, it has nothing to do with actual Filipino culture. It's all about the lens under which Filipinos are viewed, or really the white gaze, if you have to be really specific about it. So I'm more interested in how Filipinos are represented than actual, like an actual kind of cultural reality. And I don't know whether that answered your question fully. Yeah, with museums, I'm super happy about the Amon Carter. I'm really excited about it because it just feels really like unusual. I have worked with, say, like the Asian Art Museum before, to do a project, and I feel like that's really expected, and I think it's good for audiences to also see that, people can comment on American culture, from areas which are unexpected, or, I think that's gonna come up. It's like, who is this Asian person? And what does she have to say about, cowboys? And I'm like, a lot. I hope that answered it.
To run too late. Thank you. I had a question, kind of just, how you you put it really well in terms of the grand narrative and how, you can't undo it. It's kind of, you can retell the story in different ways, which to me, as you also said, it's looking at your research and trying to produce these tools of retelling the story, right? It's an epistemological project, right, of knowledge production and finding ways to reframe the story. And I was wondering, as an educator, like how do you approach on the other side of the wall, where we have to find ways to give students the tools to read those ways of knowing, right? So while we're producing these narratives and trying to reframe, we also need new ways of literacy, right? New ways of reading and unpacking these complicated and complex, histories. And I was wondering how you approach that as an educator, mostly. How do you, what kind of tools do you give students or hope to give students to kind of, unpack and find ways of literacy because we can't rely on the tools that we already have, meaning art history and all those things. I don't know why I'm doing art history in there, but you know what I'm
Art
saying.
history, yeah.
So-called art history, right?
Sure,
But
sure.
yeah, I'm really interested to know as an educator how you think about those, even for viewers too, right? Because they have to unpack what they're seeing in the space.
Yeah, yeah. Now that's a really tough question, right? Because in a way, so like I face that all the time. Like, how do you get students to slow down and also just like look really carefully? Because sometimes the most sexy thing to respond to, is actually pretty, straightforward, right? It's like we can all make statements. We can make political statements. We can say this is good or this is bad. And then what happens usually is a kind of very immediate response as opposed to like, a sifting and thinking and analyzing and then critically engaging. And so I think, like right now, actually it's funny, in my class, I all assigned them to, they had to go into, they were each assigned an archive that they had to find something in. And a lot of these archives are really weird and really obscure, and they're not necessarily a thing that a student might find that they're, immediately drawn to. But I'm like, no, you have to find something in there. And it's a challenge for them because they have to see themselves somehow reflected in something that didn't, necessarily welcome them, or that, it's not obvious. And so I don't know if they understand yet that that's going to be interesting or not, but I feel like, those sort of left field assignments or prompts, is one way I'm trying to do it. But it's something about slowing down, because I think right now, too, slogans are really popular, of like, if to make a political or social statement. And yet I think that it's very legible in many ways, but I think it can also miss sometimes some of the narratives that need a lot more like working out, Like I could argue that a crappy picture of a cave from 1972 isn't very overtly political. You're like, what is that? But if you start to pick apart like what that image is, was saying, and how once it gets degraded, what it keeps saying, then I think it gets interesting. Instead of saying like colonialism bad. I mean, of course it's bad. But like what's in there? I hope that answered or started to address it. Thanks a lot. And thanks everyone. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Stan and Stephanie.
Yeah. Thanks so much. Appreciate it. I feel like we've all kind of we were sort of getting towards the end. I wanted to make sure well, we did. First thing all tonight, too. Yeah. I don't know who all RSVP'd or if anyone got the memo that there was supposed to RSVP.